Good afternoon, everyone, both here in Louisville and online. I believe we're streaming at this point. My name is Lisa Bjorkman. I teach in the Department of Urban and Public Affairs, and I am standing in today for David Buckley while he tries not to spread a virus that knocked him out yesterday. Our event today is sponsored by the Center for Asian Democracy here at U of L. Which exists to promote scholarship about topics of democracy and rights across Asia. This is CAD's last in-person event for this academic year, but please do check out CAD's website, Twitter, and Facebook feeds for announcements about future events. So we are thrilled to be able to wrap up this semester's events with a talk on religion and nationalism in the Philippines by CAD visiting fellow Professor Jayeel Cornelio. And there is going to be time after the talk, either both in video and in chat. And we're going to be monitoring the chat throughout the talk. Jayeel Cornelio is Professor of Development Studies at Ateneo de Manila University, where he holds the Faura, did I say that right? Faura Research Foundation Professorial Chair. His scholarly work revolves around the areas of religious change, religion and public life, and the sociology of generations. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to hear more about sociology of generations.
That's not what we're talking about today.
Okay. Well, ask that in the question. Among the books that he's authored or edited, these include Being Catholic in Contemporary Philippines, Young People Reinterpreting Religion in 2016, and Rethinking Filipino Millennials, Alternative Perspectives on a Misunderstood Generation, which came out in 2020 and which won Best Book in Social Sciences in the Philippines in 2022 National Book Awards. Jayeel is currently co-running two projects funded by the British Academy. The first is a major study on the role of local faith actors in peace building, and a 2-year mentoring program for aspiring scholars of religion and public life. For his scholarship, Jayeel has received several national recognitions, including the Virginia Miralao Excellence in Research Award from the Philippine Social Science Council in 2015, and Outstanding Young Scientist Award from the National Academy of Science and Technology in 2017. In 2021, Jayeel was named among the Outstanding Young People of the Philippines for his contributions to education and sociology. Jayeel finished his PhD in sociology in 2011 at the National University of Singapore as a scholar of the Asia Research Institute, and was a visiting scholar at Lancaster University and a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, where we were postdocs together for a number of years in Göttingen, Germany. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Jayeel Cornelio, and we are very much.
Thank you, Lisa. I have come to the conclusion that Louisville is the center of the world. It brings people together all the way from Göttingen, which is a small town in Germany, to Louisville, a smallish town in the US. Big city, small, small, big, relative, all relative. Relative to Mumbai, the Philippines, it's very small. To Manila and Mumbai, where these are words. Thank you so much. Political science led by Trish, really amazing. David, this is the best time to get sick. Thank you so much for bringing me over, for making this happen. And all the wonderful people of CAD, Emily, Lisa, Emily and Shareth and Will, and all the amazing people behind CAD and political science. Really, thank you so much. The time that I have here, finally, not teaching. I love teaching, but we do need to rest our hearts and minds, from all administrative work. And for 9 years, I was an administrator in my university. So now I'm finally able to reclaim my sanity. And so by writing my book. Okay, thank you so much for coming. Let's just do this, maybe 30, 40 minutes, and then the open forum. The Philippines is the only Christian nation in Asia. This claim is not unusual for any Filipino. It is, for one, often found in media commentaries about Filipinos and their spectacular religiosity. Even state agencies echo this idea. For many religious leaders, the assumption is also taken for granted. This is why they support whatever legislative move that they can think of, to teach, for example, biblical literacy, and Christian principles in public schools. So deep-seated is the idea that it becomes a problem whenever one thinks of corruption, poverty, and social ills in the Philippines. Why do we rank as a corrupt country despite being the only Christian nation in Asia? The claim is a mistake for two reasons. The first is demographic. Proportionally speaking, Timor-Leste, the youngest state in Southeast Asia, the 11th, has by far more Catholics than the Philippines. The second reason is that the state, based on the constitution, is secular. The practice of religion in public space, such as this religious procession, Black Nazarene, one of the biggest, worth experiencing if you want to understand religiosity in the country. Try to squeeze in if you can. Is generally allowed in the spirit of benevolent neutrality. David Buckley has written tremendously about this. Education and healthcare are some other examples where religion and state have cooperated in the form of tax breaks and funding support. Benevolent secularism or benevolent neutrality recognizes too the role of religious groups in the formulation of policies, especially in areas they could be heavily involved in. Alongside showcase of democracy, the label, the only Christian in Asia, nation in Asia, was applied to the Philippines when the country gained its independence from the US in 1946. It was an American label. Although both labels asserted the uniqueness of the country in post-war Asia, they denoted a condescending attitude towards the rest of our neighbors in Southeast Asia. Thus, the country's foreign secretary at the time already wanted to abandon this particular label. And yet, the claim that the Philippines is the only Christian nation in Asia prevails. In spite of its geopolitical undertone, I will show that this has gained traction over time because it became a powerful religious assertion. The official documents of the Catholic Church were instrumental initially in this regard. But I will also argue that the religious landscape in the Philippines has become far more diverse, and all these other religious groups are also making the same claim. That's what the book is about, the different claims. Now, the claim that the Philippines is a Christian nation made by different religious groups. A useful way of framing these assertions is in terms of theological nationalism. We're all familiar with Christian nationalism. I'm using theological nationalism. This will be the guiding framework for this talk. Theological nationalism refers to the discursive claims made by religious groups about the Christian identity of the Philippines by relying on theologically inspired justifications for the divine destiny of the country. To this end, these religious groups rely on the Bible, scriptures, divine revelation, prophecy, all of that. I'll be mentioning some of them in the course of this presentation. Of course, I will be highlighting discourses coming from the Catholic Church, but I will also be relying on statements made by other emerging Christian groups, mega churches, evangelicals, restorationist churches, non-Trinitarian churches, indigenous churches, and the Philippines is really an exciting place to study religion because of all the emergence of all these different religious groups. Towards the end of my talk, I will be reflecting on the social and political consequences of theological nationalism in the Philippines, specifically with respect to certain civil liberties that other countries already enjoying. Divorce. We don't have a divorce law in the Philippines. The only country without any divorce law, except for the Vatican, but nobody gets married in the Vatican. So it's not counted. So the only Philippines is the only country without a divorce law. Same-sex marriage, the struggle for gender equality, all of that will come into play in the book. By theological nationalism, I refer to the discursive act to assert the religious identity of a nation state by drawing on theological justifications. It's the theology that I'm very interested in. It is, in a manner of speaking, a theology that claims the nation. The discourse has two aspects, or two questions, if you will. On the one hand, I'm asking what exactly is being claimed. Is it the entire archipelago of more than 7,000 islands? Or is it certain specific area or a specific, is it policy making? What exactly, right? Or is it specific law? Or is it specific, other specific battlegrounds that this claim is fighting over? And then the next question is, what are the religious worldviews, beliefs, or convictions that inform the claim that the Philippines is a Christian nation? So I'm going to be using a lot of Bible today. Not God Bless the USA Bible, but the Bible reference. I'm thinking of getting a copy for myself, but it's so expensive. So if you get a discount, please let me know. In a way, these two questions mirror the emerging theological reflections troubled by supremacist Christian nationalism around the world. There's a theologian called Dorian Llewellyn who rightly observes many nations have claimed chosen people status by a selective arrogation of texts from the Hebrew Bible. And the Philippines is not unique in that case. But the book I'm writing is not theological, even though I am aware that many theologians and people in the faith community are going to, and as they already have been reading my work and are going to read this book, I imagine they would be very much interested in this. My choice to be narrow recognizes that inasmuch as religious nationalism takes shape in varying degrees around the world, its manifestations all rely on a religious vision, on a particular religious basis. So this is why I am focusing on the theological content, and its underpinnings demand a closer look from a social scientific perspective. This emphasis on the theological content of religious nationalism draws inspiration from recent scholarship. The first is what Joel Cabrita, for example, just quick literature review. The first is what Joel Cabrita in South Africa refers to as theological nationalism. So it's not my phrase, it's directly from him. It is the religious discourse that national unity must be based on virtue, healing, peacefulness, and submission to Jehovah's directives. The life and teachings of Isaiah Shembe, one of the founder of the Nazarene Church in South Africa, are very instructive. Joel analyzed Shembe's religious discourse in the early 20th century, and he demonstrates that the religious leader was convinced that his church and not the Zulu monarchy was going to save the nation, right? And his prayers also were in effect powerful commentaries about the sins of the monarchy. Unfortunately, it was the people who were suffering, right? The judgment from God, you know. And so the only recourse was for all the people to become members of the Nazarene Church. So that's one. The other strand is obviously Christian nationalism in the US. So advanced. It is a set of beliefs that restore and privilege the myths, values, identity, and authority of white Christian America. Thus, it is a deeply religious conviction about US history, politics, and society. Drawing on quantitative data, this is the recent trend here, scholars of Christian nationalism argue that it is a phenomenon on its own, with unmistakable consequences on public life. It cannot be reduced to ethnocentrism, political ideologies, or other worldviews alone. At least that's what we hear from Whitehead, from Sam Perry, Baker. They rely on public attitudes on various issues, so survey, a lot of quantitative data, whether the Declaration of Independence was divinely inspired, whether the federal government should declare that the US is a Christian nation, whether the federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces, and whether the federal government should allow prayer in public schools. Where my present work deviates, and this is what to me is the interesting part, is in my emphasis on the very theological content of this nationalism. This is why one of the questions I asked in my project is theological, the religious worldviews, the beliefs, the ideas that justify that the Philippines is a Christian nation. In this sense, my work is closer to the scholarship on American religious exceptionalism. The pervasive idea that God guides US history and that the country has a special destiny to fulfill for itself and the rest of the world. McDaniel and his colleagues, for example, bring attention to the power of myths and shared stories that shape not just a community's identity, but also its practices, structures, and institutions. In the context of American religious exceptionalism, Christians in the 18th century, for example, rightly chose the eagle as your national symbol because they were reading. It was based on a rereading of end time accounts to mythologize the birth of the young nation as a fulfillment of God's rule on earth. The founders were justified in choosing the eagle as a national symbol. In the book of Revelation, the eagle is both the harbinger of justice and also the savior of people from around the world, carrying people away from the tribulation. If you're into the what's that the book Rapture and all that, and also the book by the Last Days book. I used to be fond of those books when I was less informed as a sociologist. Okay. So we have our own version, of course. Let me now explain how theological nationalism has taken shape in Philippine society. Because of its history and predominance, the Catholic Church, through its bishops, has produced many statements. But I also wish to emphasize that the religious landscape in the Philippines, as I have already said, has become far more diverse now. Many Christian groups, including megachurches, independent churches, and even indigenous churches, have become influential in their own ways, membership, finances, and even their political influence. I'll come to that in a bit. But let me just focus first on the Catholic Church. I recounted how the idea that the Philippines is the only Christian nation began as a geopolitical statement. It was an American label for the Philippines. However, I'm not denying the longer history of the Philippines with Spain. We were under Spain for more than 300 years. That's why many of our surnames are Hispanic. Um, and 80% of Filipinos are Catholic. But I also wanted to highlight that in the 20th century, there was a shift, right? It was an American label. How did the geopolitical tone become a religious claim that to this day still shapes public life in the Philippines? One answer brings us back to the 1950s. 1950s. This was in Manila. That's the president right over there and in the center. During the National Eucharistic Congress, very Catholic, in 1954, no less than President Ramon Magsaysay himself dedicated the entire Filipino people to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. This was it. This is a prayer. We are especially grateful for the light of faith, which we uniquely among the nations of the Far East enjoy, and for the air of freedom in which, shielded by our Constitution, we may live and act with the liberty and dignity befitting men who have been created in the image and likeness of God. The act was heavily criticized in the media for violating church-state separation. As early as 1898, our Constitution, so this was when the Philippines declared its independence, already made it very clear that it was going to be a secular state. But here, this thing still come into play even to this day. But just the same, this was a very useful act on the part of President Magsaysay. According to Chelly Barry, who's a U.S. Historian who's based in Thailand, given the rise of communism in Asia, it was unmistakable that the consecration to the Sacred Heart of Jesus was at once religious and political. Jayeel, what does that mean? Through the writings of its bishops, the Catholic Church played a significant role in galvanizing this claim. Relying on bishop statements in the 1940s, Jose Mario Francisco, a colleague of mine, a theologian, a Jesuit priest, astute historian, narrates the trajectory of this imaginary. In the 1940s, nationalist sentiments that rejected the role of the Catholic Church in public life made bishops very defensive. Specifically, in the wake of Philippine independence, public education became a battleground. Religious instruction was to be eliminated from public education, and nationalist publications introduced in public schools. In 1950, the Catholic Welfare Organization, the predecessor of what is now known as the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, condemned the teaching of Rafael Palma's biography of Jose Rizal. Those of you who are familiar, Jose Rizal is technically the national hero of the Philippines. Nobody would contest Jose Rizal's, prominence in our public life today. Nobody's going to question that. But the Catholic Church did in the 1940s, because he wrote two novels that were clearly critical of the Spanish regime. And these two novels are still taught to this day by virtue of what's called the Rizal Law from the 1950s in public education, both in public and private education. So even I, when I was a kid, had to read these two books. See what the Catholic Church said back at the time when this was being debated. We believe that we would seriously fail in our duty if we did not raise our voice of warning and protest against the attempt by the enemies of the Catholic name to impose on the young people in our public schools the reading of a book written by a well-known anti-Catholic, which is highly offensive to the religious sentiment of over 80% of the population of the Philippines. From the 1960s onwards, a shift took place in which the Catholic Church began seeing its role as to side with the Filipino people, particularly the marginalized. So there was a shift more into social justice. The shift coincided with the Second Vatican Council. 4, Francisco, statements released by the CBCP from then on viewed the Philippines as a Catholic nation at work in the task of national development. This was a major turn for the Catholic Church, which beforehand was accused of elitism. In the 1970s, in 1970, the CBCP declared the Philippines is a Christian and a democratic country, verbatim. In the spirit of this conviction, the clergy made commentaries on social and political concerns. For the record, this was the time when Ferdinand Marcos, the father of our current president, was already in power, and it was in 1972 when he declared his martial law, which lasted until the early 1980s, and Marcos was our president officially until 1986. So it was a very long period, and the Catholic Church took upon itself this big role. So, in fact, the pastoral exhortation, in one of its pastoral exhortations on Philippine politics, the CBCP claims that our faith in God has played a key role in major revolutions, events of our history, even in a decidedly political matter like the People Power Revolution of EDSA, which toppled Marcos in 1986. So, you see, this is one of the most iconic photos from that period. Indeed, social justice as an ideal has underpinned Catholic movements around the country in the struggle for democracy and human rights, especially after 1986. To this day, the Catholic Church, through its Catechism for Filipino Catholics, I really love reading that book because you learn a lot, and you have more reasons to write about this, continues to frame the Philippines as the only Christian nation among our Asian brethren. Okay, this is an interesting sentence. There are deep affinities between Christ's message and the Filipinos in most ways of thinking and acting. Forget that there are 5% Muslims. Forget that there are many non-Catholics. Forget that there are 0.1% atheists, and all of that. So Catholic Church. Are you still okay? Okay, I just wanted to be sure that if I speak too fast, sometimes I just rattle off, just catching myself. Okay. Let me now turn to the wider religious landscape in the Philippines. Even if Catholicism remains a dominant church in the population, religious diversity is evident in the rise of independent Christian organizations, many of which have also gone global to cater to the needs of Filipino migrant workers. So wherever there are Filipinos, most likely there is one of these churches would be present. I have yet to find them though in Louisville. I'm very hopeful still. I'm still counting on my belief that Louisville is the center of the world. Mega churches like Victory, it has three headquarters: one in Manila, one in London, and one in Nashville. Of course, it has to be Nashville, right? Evangelical churches like Jesus is Lord. Indigenous restorationist churches like the Kingdom of Jesus Christ, Pastor Apollo Tibuloy, and Iglesia ni Cristo, Church of Christ. These two are restorationist churches, non-Trinitarian in their theology, which is why to this day they're still considered cults by the majority. But in any case, they're extremely influential financially, politically. Their prominence is evident in several respects. For example, their buildings are unmistakable architectural feats, which I have elsewhere described as religious worlding. This is an example of that. So when Iglesia ni Cristo built celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2014, they built the Philippine Arena, which is supposed to be the largest indoor stadium in the world. If Taylor Swift were to hold a concert in the Philippines today, it has to be there. But she chose to go to Singapore, so too bad. Too bad for Iglesia ni Cristo. This was a big Southeast Asian controversy. Why skip the Philippines? It's a Swifty country. Emily, yes, it is a Swifty country. I know Emily is a Swifty, I think. So there it is. So Philippine Arena for you. So that was my previous project, religious worlding. They are also known for their television programs, etc. Finally, they are involved in local and national politics in ways that shape electoral outcomes. So the Iglesia ni Cristo, for example, this particular church, so they do what political scientists would normally call block voting, and 70% adherence, of their members. Because the idea is that following the leader is also following God. Disobeying the leader is therefore disobeying God. So it's a theology of ecclesial unity. Okay? Put differently, these Christian churches may be the minority, but their visibility is no longer deniable. Analysis of their theological claims to the nation requires some nuance. The claims are made on the basis of A, the divine calling of the nation. I'm going to get to that in a bit. And B, the need to uphold certain values that they believe God wants for the Philippines in order for the country to progress. In my view, these logics differ from the theological nationalism of the Catholic Church. Many of the official statements of the Catholic Church about the Philippines are deployed in defense against ideologies inimical to its religious heritage, which ultimately defines Filipino-ness. So, gender equality, for example, or the use of the public funding for artificial contraceptives. That was a huge debate in 2013 and the years before that. The Catholic Church resisted that because to them, no, this is not who we are as Filipinos. We believe in the family and life and so forth. Okay, that was the Catholic Church. Emerging churches do not necessarily make this claim, the churches that I am moving on to now. Instead, by appealing to the divine calling of the nation and to biblical values, they are in effect asking for spiritual conversion for the sake of the nation. Implicitly, this appeal is a critique of the failure of the Catholic Church to inspire moral and national renewal. To inspire moral and national renewal was indeed the hope of Brother Eddie Villanueva, who ran for the presidency in the Philippines in 2004, lost, and then again in 2010, lost. For senator in 2014, lost. The founder and head pastor of Jesus is Lord, he is the founder of Jesus is Lord, the biggest evangelical church in the Philippines. Villanueva formed the party believing that the country needed to be governed by righteous leaders. The party was called, is it here? No, it's not here. Bangon Pilipinas, Philippines Arise. And Villanueva's campaign was run by the Intercessors for the Philippines and the Philippines for Jesus movement, two organizations Villanueva himself founded in the 1980s. Launched as initiatives for God and country, Diyos at Bayan, God and country, they pray for a transformation on the premise that only the gospel can change the course of history. Sounds familiar, I suppose, for Americans. So that's one, okay? Victory, a church that targets students, espouses the same principle. The church is not politically involved in a strict sense, but their reasoning for establishing local congregations on campuses, university campuses around the world, around the country is revealing. This is Victory, targets a lot of young people. So wherever there are universities, you're very sure to find a Victory congregation there. This is how they reason explain. Why they're targeting specifically young people in universities. Virtually all of the world's presidents, prime ministers, senators, members of parliaments, bankers, lawyers, judges, teachers, doctors, and business leaders have passed through the college and university system. In every critical aspect of a nation's culture, the campus is where we find the future influencers. In other words, converting students while in universities can make them values-driven influencers of society. Save the kids, save the nation. Very much like your heroes from the 2010s, save the cheerleader, save the world, save the world. So those of us who came of age at that time, you will remember that. That was a long time ago. Heroes, okay. Established in the 1980s, Victory now has more than 90 outreach churches and 400 missionaries on 700 campuses around the country. Evident in the theological nationalism of emerging churches is the divine calling of the Philippines. This divine calling is most of the time linked to global missions. This much is true in the case of Jesus is Lord, Brother Eddie, and Victory, this church, churches that have outreaches around the world. For them to send missionaries is the divine destiny of the Philippines, which explains why they have established training centers in the country. In fact, among Christians, and so I grew up Catholic and then I became evangelical when I was a teenager. One of the big mantras that we had in the 1990s was that the Philippines was the Antioch of Asia. And we believed that. And then when I studied in Singapore, I realized that even Singaporeans were calling themselves as the only Antioch of Asia. So we're all Antiochs in Southeast Asia. But that was a very powerful line that animated mission work among evangelicals in the 1990s, even to this day, through these mega churches. For Victory, our role in our larger global movement is to reach every nation in Asia. Quite simply, Asia is our mission field. However, if we are to make disciples of all nations, it is imperative that we identify and plant churches in key cities in the region This is how we honor God and make disciples in Asia, the center of which is the Philippines. In other cases, theological nationalism is rooted in the prophetic calling of churches and their founders. Iglesia ni Cristo, this is their official magazine, Pasugo, God's Message. INC, for example, declares itself to be the one true church in the last days, whose founder, Felix Manalo, was prophesied in the Bible itself. INC was established in 1914, which was established in 1914, believes that Manalo was the Filipino angel of the East, who fulfilled ancient prophecies set forth in Isaiah, Revelation, and other biblical texts. Today, INC has more than 2 million members around the world. Its worldwide expansion has been made possible by its global media, philanthropic work around the world, and its aggressive training of missionaries who speak local languages. I love watching their television programs because, you turn on the TV at one time, if they're speaking Portuguese, Filipinos, brown men speaking Portuguese, and obviously they're targeting Portuguese-speaking countries, or Spanish, or nobody speaks Latin, but certainly a lot of European countries, and also African languages, because they're also actively targeting and purchasing properties in many parts of Africa. I think also in the US. Similarly, the Kingdom of Jesus Christ claims that its founder, Apollo Kibuloy, another religious group, is the appointed Son of God, not the begotten Son of God, but the appointed Son of God. Kibuloy himself had a mystical encounter at the root of Mount Apo, the highest peak in the Philippines, in southern Philippines, which convinced him that the place was destined to be the New Jerusalem. He has transformed the area into the prayer mountain and paradise garden of Eden restored. The church claims 7 million followers around the world, with the Philippines playing a central role in the last days. Alluding to scriptural references, his life story recounts the encounter with God as follows. The standard I use in this mountain for salvation is the standard I will use all over the world. The Father had said, I will send you to them. I have many children in the cities of the world. They don't know you and you don't know them. But when they hear your voice, they will follow you because my sheep know my voice. For your information, Kibuloy is now wanted by the FBI because of because of human trafficking and sexual abuses. And I am somehow implicated in that. I write for one of the biggest news websites. I'm not into human trafficking, made it clear, right? A couple of years ago, Rappler, one of the biggest news websites in the Philippines, for which I also write on a monthly basis, led an investigative report exposing his human trafficking and sexual abuses. And obviously, I was one of the resource persons for Rappler, and his church filed a series of cyber libel cases against us. And I was the only academic that was targeted there. So if that even, and we were afraid to a certain extent because he was the spiritual advisor of the previous president, Duterte, right? And the pastor, the head of this current church, by the way, is now the special envoy of the current president to Filipinos overseas. So they're all politically influential. You get the picture now, okay? But this one in particular was the spiritual advisor of President Duterte, and we were afraid that we would go to jail eventually. But thankfully, all the cases have been dismissed, and now conversations are taking shape now whether the Philippines should extradite eventually this man to the U.S. Let's see how it goes. Okay, wrapping up. In competing visions, I now return to the two questions I posed at the onset concerning theological nationalism as a discursive act. What exactly is being claimed, and what are the religious worldviews, beliefs, or convictions that inform the claim to the Christian identity of the nation? Theological nationalism claims the Christian identity of the Philippines, but as I have just discussed, what this entails differs depending on who makes the assertion. For the Catholic Church, it has been about education, politics, social justice. For the emerging churches, it has been about divine calling, global missions, national renewal. The justifications also differ. For the Catholic Church, it's the long history of the Philippines with the faith and its consecration to God, 1950s President Magsaysay. For the emerging churches, by contrast, it's the basis is found in divine encounters, prophecies, the Bible, the centrality of spiritual conversion, even the Great Commission. To claim that the Philippines is a Christian nation is clearly normative. But I also wish to point out that it's not homogeneous. It can vary. One reason here is that the Catholic Church is no longer the most important, the most influential church in the country. So there are many other churches that are casting their vision, so to speak. But the other reason is that there are also competing visions of what it means to really be a Christian nation. My view is that it is a double-edged sword that can be used either in defense of an inclusive society, right? Because we're a Christian nation, we should love the Muslims. Because we're a Christian nation, we should welcome asylum seekers. You get the picture, right? Or refugees and so forth. But the other vision casts this as a weapon, frames it as a weapon. Because we are a Christian nation, we should not allow divorce. We should not allow gender equality. Because we are a Christian nation, we should push for the death penalty, which is one of the chapters that I am writing in the book. This tension is to be expected given the discussed churches, religious diversity, and competing truth claims about about morality, divine authority, and the common good. For example, social justice through faith-based activism and national renewal through converted disciples, young people, are two principles that operate with different assumptions and end goals. One is more inclusive, the other is about the curtailment of civil liberties. On the one hand, a case can be made that theological nationalism engenders an inclusive vision where differences are welcome and the welfare of the marginalized emphasized. The Catholic Church has done this. Iglesia Ni Cristo has also done this. But the contemporary theological claim to the nation poses its own problems as well. Inasmuch as it has served the common good, the experience of the Philippines shows that it has also been weaponized against policies the Catholic Church considers inimical to its doctrine. This is where theological nationalism becomes militant and its vision exclusive, which is why one of the chapters I'm writing in the book is about militant Christianity. This has led to the curtailment of civil liberties. For example, in the name of national holiness, I mentioned this already, but let me just reiterate it, Catholic clergy and lay resisted progressive policies involving artificial contraceptives, divorce, same-sex marriage, and gender equality. When Pope Francis, the beloved Pope in the Philippines, visited the Philippines in 2015, he urged the faithful to resist what he called ideological colonization through contraceptives and same-sex marriage. In fact, the Catholic Church has relied on intellectuals and lawyers to lobby its case in Congress. To this day, these laws are still unpassed. Interestingly, same-sex, gender equality in particular, contraception has already been passed in 2013. Interestingly, some religious leaders themselves or members of their religiously inspired parties have become politicians. In this capacity, they have used the Bible to argue that Duterte's bloody war on drugs, if you have a question about that, I'm happy to answer that. That was my previous work too. They have argued that the bloody war on drugs was necessary to cleanse Philippine society of its social ills. In fact, in one of my in my field work, we chanced upon one priest who likened Duterte to King Josiah in the Old Testament, and King Josiah is known for having removed all the idols in Judah. And President Duterte was the King Judah of the Philippines in the 21st century, removing all the idols of criminality and substance, illegal substance in the Philippines. Many of these people have also used theological insights to argue against moves to legalize same-sex marriage and gender equality in the country. Brother Eddie, who ran for president, now is a congressman. And he's there. He's not holding the minutes of the meeting, he's holding, just for the record, the Bible. Not God bless the USA, but the Bible nevertheless. There, right there at the podium in the Philippine House of Congress, the lower house of Congress. So we follow the American model, lower house, upper house. All these point to, and this was in one of the debates about gender equality, if I'm not mistaken. All these point to how theological nationalism curtails civil liberties. Once again, this is not unique to the Philippine case. Around the world, the chosen people narrative has animated xenophobia and punitive measures against people it considers its enemy. Overall, these recent developments raise important concerns about the contributions of religion to public life in the Philippines. Both observers and religious actors themselves need to think about these contributions, which is why I'm writing this book, not just because of their implications for church-state relations, separation, but because the majority of Filipinos do not agree with religious influence on policy making. This is interesting. One issue is religious diversity and the pursuit of the common good. Theological nationalism has embraced a very narrow understanding of Christianity and citizenship, which has overlooked legitimate calls for divorce and gender equality, for example. Advocacy in support of such initiatives has been drowned out by theological nationalism. In this sense, theological nationalism contradicts the principles of dialogue, responsibility, openness, and diversity embraced by public theology. The other issue is related. The other issue is related to theological nationalism and the rise of populist strongmen, or strongman politics, like Duterte, who threatened when he was president that he will kill anybody who will destroy my country. Theological nationalism and populism parallel each other in upholding the nation and defending it against its enemies, many of whom are imagined in the name of national holiness and renewal. Much has been said about the politics of illiberal reform and the rise of populist strongmen. My book brings in the religious dimension in support for populist regimes, for example, or the rise of Ferdinand Marcos. On Wednesday, I'm going to be speaking with David's class, and I'll be talking about the rise of Marcos Jr., about religion and the rise of Marcos Jr. Following the empirical questions raised in this talk, the rest of the book will turn to 4 issues that have in recent years tested the limits of Christian Philippines: reproductive health, death penalty, war on drugs, and gender equality. I'm happy to discuss all of this with you if you so wish. Thank you so much. Yes, on the dot.
That was remarkably timely. I realize that some of you may need to leave for class in 15 minutes or so we're just going to open it up and take questions, and I'm happy to moderate.
Yes, please.
And by moderate, I mean I'll just point at you if you raise your hand.
So I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned, and obviously the Philippines is a strong Catholic tradition, but you mentioned kind of the presence of evangelical churches there. And one of the things that's interesting in the United States, right, is that we've kind of moved from a place in this politics where the Catholic Church and evangelicals were at odds with one another, to which they found common cause over a lot of social policy issues such as reproductive rights, also LGBT issues. And so we sort of see this kind of merging, I guess, over maybe the late 1980s, and now you have like the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that's always filing in abortion cases alongside groups like Focus on the Family. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about to what extent in the Philippines there's tension between the evangelical and kind of Catholic leadership, and to what extent they see it as like politically expedient to sort of maintain this narrative that you're describing. It's really interesting.
Yes. What I'm trying to say in the book is that regardless of their theological differences, they're all coming together, right? It's like fortress Catholicism in England back in the 19th century, right? In defense of of the faith and orthodoxy. And now, only that now we're seeing that they're all coming together in spite of their theological differences. Having said that, I don't want to downplay, and you're right. I don't want to downplay the how the Catholic Church, for example, wants to distance itself from the Iglesia ni Cristo. Right? Again and again, theologians and priests would say the Iglesia ni Cristo is not Christian because it doesn't believe that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is God. It's not a Trinitarian church. And for the record, also, Iglesia ni Cristo began, and to this day, you can still find a lot of its rhetoric to be anti-Catholic. And you can say the same thing about the other emerging churches. Evangelicalism is quite an interesting. I think there has to be a book specifically about evangelicalism in the Philippines. I don't think I don't have the energy for it just yet. But it's because back in the 19th, I've written a few chapters about them, but we can trace the history. It was in the 1980s when American missionaries started to go to the Philippines. This was as the dictatorship was falling apart. American missionaries were setting up, planting churches, evangelical churches, which are now the mega churches in the Philippines. So many of them emerged in the 1980s. At that time, evangelicals were considered the born against, right? The cult, right? The praise the Lord people, or we call alive, after the charismatic song "Alive, Alive." So it was meant to be to poke fun at at them and to make fun of them. But now that doesn't seem to be the case. It's so timely to talk about this now because in the 21st century Philippines, they are credible political players in their own right, religious and political players. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So you mentioned one of the evangelical churches argues that the leader, following the leader, is following the God, and there is this hierarchy.
Yes.
That's also the very medieval Catholic Church hierarchy of the chain, right? That follow the God and then the church and the monarch. So I'm wondering, are there any institutional differences in terms of hierarchy between evangelical churches and Catholic churches in the Philippines, or are they similar in that regard?
Excellent. Well, why is this interesting to you?
Because I think that might have implications for access, for what degree of barrier to entry, barrier to decision making in the institution itself.
Super. This is a great question. Okay, the INC is a rigid church. In fact, just to give you an idea, if I were to interview anyone from INC, Iglesia ni Cristo, I have to get the approval of the very executive minister. And being an academic is very useful. When they produced their documentary back in 2014 for their 100th anniversary, they identified me as one of their resource persons, for their documentary. So you watch it, I'm there. And I said a lot of things there, but they only quoted the nice things that I said about the church. Like, this is a church that has reached its milestone, etc., etc. And so tit for tat, I asked them, okay, I'm going to allow you to interview me, but you're going to allow me to interview you also. So that was how I did it. So that's an example of how rigid the organization is. The Catholic Church is a little different because, especially with the move post Vatican II and so forth, you've got a lot more people who are participating in their own ways and also challenging even the bishops and the priests. So in a way, there's more porosity within the Catholic Church. Evangelicals are also, it depends on where you are. The mega churches, they can be very rigid. They can look very relaxed from the outside, but once you're inside, the social control for doctrinal obedience, allegiance, and so forth. Yeah. So it varies. It takes a lot of good ethnographic work to identify these different mechanisms. Having said that, Iglesia ni Cristo and Apollo Kibuloy, because these are what the literature refers to as high control and high demand religion. I don't want to use the word cult because it's loaded, but in the literature, sociology of religion, it's high control, high demand. The obedience of the leader is in effect obedience to God. Yes.
So, and if you ask me why I'm asking, I'll be happy to talk about that. But so this slide, right, shows the threat of violence.
Yes.
And the threat of violence was very present throughout your presentation. So could you maybe tell us a little bit more about whether, or the extent to which there's actual violence taking place in the name of religion in this context?
In the name of religion. Oh, religious violence.
Or religious violence, or violence justified by religion in any way.
Interesting. My research has been primarily focused on how religion has enabled the war on drugs, for example. Let's focus on the war on drugs. The war on drugs, depending on statistics that you use, official statistics would say 6,000. But if you look at the Human Rights Watch records, 30,000 people died. Extrajudicial killings, people getting shot, etc. Exactly. Now, here's the thing. So when I did one of my field work in one of the urban poor hotspots in Manila, so a lot of people died there, and so a lot of families without fathers anymore because of the extrajudicial killings. I realized that there were a lot of churches there. And what I was very much interested in, churches, like different churches, what I was very much interested in, to be honest, was how were the churches responding? The Catholic Church in particular, right? And obviously the Catholic Church was doing a lot of pastoral work and a lot of helping the orphans and so forth. But it was inescapable for us to also talk to the pastors themselves, to the Baptist pastor, to the ministers in the area. And that was when we realized that they were in fact very supportive of the war on drugs. So that was when we discovered that religion is that one dimension that political scientists were not talking about, because normally the war on drugs is always illiberal reform, right? Illiberal democracy and all that. But in the Philippine society, where there is, which is arguably one of the most religious in the world, depending on the surveys that you look at, then religion needs to be confronted. So has it? What I'm saying is that at the very least, it's a discourse that enables this kinds of violence. Whether it has led to blah, to murder is another thing.
Right, but it justify makes sense.
That to me is important.
Yeah,
That
right,
is
right. That
important.
was the question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to
Yeah.
jump in and follow up on this question. One of the things that I kept thinking about as you were talking, Jayeel, that is occurring to me now. So if I understand the argument you're making in trying to introduce this question of religiosity, there's this, you make this argument about claims, the way in which different groups are claiming the nation. And you're sort of unpacking, like, what is this nation? And, what can be done in the name of what nation? But then you make this move that I find really interesting, where you're saying you're interested in the beliefs that underpin the legitimacy. You don't use the word legitimacy, but there's something about the relationship between beliefs that are the kind of like the landscape that sort of enable or facilitate the. Am I correct in saying this is the kind of the currency of which claims are effective? And I'm wondering, how does one study? It's a methodological question, right? So I mean, you mentioned ethnography at the end, but this is also, I'm like channeling Vanderveer here, right? Where he's like, how do you study belief? Like, all you can do is study what people tell you about their beliefs, which is not the same thing as their beliefs. So I guess I'm wondering about the status of this argument, particularly in light of the way in which particular kinds of, claims to belief are legitimating violence.
Excellent.
Ultimately. Like, how do we think about that?
Excellent. Methodologically.
Yeah.
Methodologically.
Yeah, like, how do we think about, because ultimately, if we connect the dots, we're saying that, violence is legitimated against this backdrop of belief. And I'm just wondering about
how do you do that? Okay. Disclaimer: the book primarily draws on official statements and statements made by the big political figures, religious leaders, etc. Because that's all I could do, right? That's all I could do. But other scholars would talk about what they call the ambient beliefs, what the God talk, the everyday God talk,
myths and
the shared stories, So in my case, it was after interviewing the pastors that we discovered that they're using this psalm or this particular Old Testament text to justify Duterte's work. Obviously, it's a pastor. So a God talk ethnographer, an ambient theology ethnographer would be interested in how that plays out in everyday conversations when people watch television, they saw it in the news, and and they make quick comments like, "Yes, rightly so, they should die." I mean, etc., etc. Yeah.
Because that's exactly what I was thinking about it, right? Like at the level of you're at the top, right? What happens at the down level in which all these messages are interpreted, processed. Yeah.
Well, at the very least, what I'm saying is that what I'm saying in this book seems to substantiate what we already know statistically speaking. For example, more than 80% of Filipinos supported the war on drugs. Different surveys across different quarters. But at the same time, 79% of Filipinos also believe that they could be next in line. So there's that fear. So this is what was the terminology? The ambivalence, the ambivalence for the support for the war on drugs. Supportive of it, but at the same time also afraid that they could be, right? So these findings may shed light on why this is the case, or the democratic ambivalence. That's what sociologists are. And there's also a question in the chat box, by the way, Lisa, if you want to. But also let's
get the chat box and then we'll get some other.
I just had a follow-up question on that.
very quickly.
Because we've got a couple of other new voices in the room, huh?
All right.
Okay, let's get one. Do you want to raise your question and I'll read this one afterwards?
Okay. You decide.
Yeah, please.
You mentioned the war on drugs.
Yes, sir.
The war on drugs for me is universal. It has nothing to do with religion. It's just a war on drugs. it's how you act on the types of methods that you're going to use to get to the war on drugs is the difference, right? So for me, I'm Filipino. I think I probably you're still in your mother's and being in your mother's island. And I survived the first Marcos
You
regime,
did, okay.
and then the next Marcos regime. So for me, I see Catholics and Christians, they're both at each other's throats. One deeply rooted in mostly rituals, right? The masses and so forth. And then the other one deeply rooted in doctrine and the Bible. So my wife is now a Christian.
Okay.
So-
Evangelical, you mean?
Yeah, so I'm Catholic, so we tend to debate on a lot of things. I don't believe in a lot of things that the Catholic faith preaches. I also do not believe in a lot of the things that the Christian people espouse, because they say Catholics are need to be Christians.
That's right. They need to be converted because they're not Christian enough.
Yeah, so for me, when you're talking about nationalism, I haven't, theological nationalism, I haven't seen it's the religion, whether it's Catholic or Christian, having an effect or impact on the politics in the Philippines. Because they seem to vote and elect murderers.
Oh, you mean that? Okay, in that sense. Okay,
So,
gotcha.
so in that
I
sense,
see.
I don't see
The effect,
the effect of
the moral.
of the whether you're a Catholic, you have a Catholic faith or a religious faith, Christian faith. I don't see it, the impact. I don't know if that's what you see, but that's what
No,
I
no.
see.
This is a question that would come freely from the faith community, and like a good professor, I would say, "What do you think?" Right, right. I would let the faith community. I would let the faith community reflect on this because ultimately, as my colleague from a Vatican-based journalist called Paolo Affatato puts it in one of his reports, based on his journalistic, gathering data around the country, he has concluded that ordinary Filipinos seem to believe that this is not a God of mercy and compassion that Filipinos believe in. It's a God, the avenger, that Filipinos believe in. So in that sense, there is an impact. There is a direct relationship between what people believe and what sort of policies they support, as far as the war on drugs is concerned. But of course, it's another story if we talk about divorce. Right? God doesn't want families to break up, and so we wouldn't want divorce. So again, the specificity of beliefs really are very important in trying to make sense of how they shape people's political attitudes. Just to drive home the point, something that I will talk about in David's class on Wednesday.
So,
Sorry.
with respect to this question regarding that, do you not think, the outgoing messages, the publications, the newsreels, all that stuff, is really differentiated between, like, for example, you get Cardinal Sin back in the day. He was more public, out in the open,
Yeah.
as opposed to Cardinal Picado.
Right.
No one knows who the heck excuse me, no one knows who he is worldwide, as opposed to
Cardinal Sin.
because he's doesn't have a
The personality.
yeah, his personality. So regardless whether you can see the benefits of religious benefits within the political system in the Philippines, could it be like an underlying seepage of that religiosity, as opposed to being like seen and being seen or being unheard, but it does exist whether it's publicized.
Well, I suppose, Tomas, the bigger question is, do Filipinos listen? Right, right. Because the reality is that, for the Catholics in particular, a survey has shown that, and I think David was also very much interested in this. A big chunk of Filipinos do not like it whenever priests use the pulpit to talk about politics. or to make commentaries about Philippine politics. So by all means, the CBCP. I mean, forget the fact that it's not a cardinal sin that we have today, right? It's not as influential as cardinal sin. But the fact remains that you have still important bishops, right? And they make statements. They do have followers, right? Wonderful people. Bishop David and Bishop Villegas is another person, etc. And they really are. They have been always brave against Duterte and now being cautious with respect to Marcos. That's another story. The point I'm making is that whatever the Catholic Church states, the statements of the Catholic Church do not necessarily reflect public opinion or do not necessarily resonate with the public. I think that's the bigger question here. Not just about the personality of the man, Cardinal Sin, or whoever the cardinal is. It was very useful in the 1970s because there was no other big figure who would contest Marcos except for the cardinal himself.
So
Now it's more democratic.
For that too is the terminology, the cross and the sword. So it seems like the cross and the sword has been happening since the Spanish arrived. You mentioned that you are secular and constitutional. In your opinion, what period in time maybe you consider Philippines being secular as far as like freedom for everybody else, and all of a sudden it's like we're going back.
I see.
We have not broke the chains of the Catholic or Christianity, where then we welcome the Americans when they arrived because they were the top secular. But
not an easy question, to be honest, right? To answer. Are we secular? Are we religious? Constitutionally, we are secular, but culturally, it's
not that we become.
But I don't want to demonize it either, Tomas. I don't want to demonize it either because I still my view of religion in public life is that for you to confront these things, right, this conservatism, this fundamentalism, it's not about the eradication. The solution is not to eradicate religion from the public sphere. I don't subscribe to that. I mean, that's classic Habermas, that's classic, the ruling out of religion from the public sphere. But in a religious society like the Philippines, where the religion is clearly there, the imprint is there in the political attitudes and people's support for this policy or that policy. The only solution I feel is to contest bad theology with good theology. So which is why one of the chapters in the book that I'm writing is about public theology. I don't want to call it public theology because it's too boring, it's too dry, but it will be that. Opening up. Sorry,
Okay,
the crowdsourcing theology. That
All right, we're gonna have the one on the chat box and then talk.
Yes, okay.
So, can you discuss the nature of international ties related to religion and nationalism in the country? Are illiberal religious leaders tied to the U.S. or Brazil or Hungary or others?
Gosh, what was the first question?
So, discussing the nature of international ties related to religion and nationalism. So, are there ties between sort of illiberal religious politics and
Interesting. Honestly, I haven't really thought about this very carefully. There might be. I'm just taking note of that, okay? But what I can credibly say is that much of the theological discourse that you find in the Philippines today resonates with American fundamentalist theology. The baker, for example, right? What do you do when a baker is asked to bake a cake for a same-sex couple, right? That is now creeping into the public discussions, or at least the statements being made by certain lobby groups, advocacy groups, who are very cautious about gender equality, and that it might be a slippery slope towards same-sex marriage eventually. That's the most that I could say for now. But I'm taking note of this because this could very well be the case.
So yeah, I wanted to follow up on the previous discussion. And the point you made about countering theology with theology. I'm wondering whether it's the content, the theological content that matters, or the institutional features that matter. In the sense that is it because of this strong, strong leader near to God, requirement of trust in that leader, that leads to a different set of voting preferences, maybe in the strongman,
Excellent question.
versus, say, in the Catholic Church that you described, which is undergoing a kind of transformation, it seems from your comments, becoming more democratic, that might, people who follow that church or maybe in that church might not be voting for a strongman preference.
Excellent, excellent. That in itself is a hypothesis worth testing, right? Illiberal reform or illiberal, populist support for liberalism, politics.
Whether
because
the
of the
medium
structure
is
of
the
government.
message in itself.
Yes, that could very. I think that's a hypothesis worth testing. I would give you that. But to me, I'm as a sociologist. I'm more interested in opening up the space for conversations because you talk to any typical Filipino. So why are you not supportive of same-sex marriage? Oh, because God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. So that's oh yes, yeah. Right. So it's a theological statement. It's a theological statement which can be easily challenged if there were enough spaces for conversation. I think. It's also anecdotal for me, so every time I write something, provocative about this, I get, messages from people who would just thank me for, oh, finally, thank you so much for articulating it that way. I never thought about it, and this has been on my mind for the longest time. And can we meet up? Can we have coffee? The kind of thing. Maybe because I still believe in the public sphere, the power of the public sphere in shaping. I still do. Right.
Just before we do the question, I see that same pattern with Bolsonaro, with
Yes.
Evangelical, with Rios Montt
Yes.
in Guatemala, who's
Absolutely.
in Hungary and Poland, this religious, national identity issue and or moral
Correct.
value system.
Can I just chip in pretty quickly? So you were, as you were talking, and this is, your work is very deeply embedded in a very specific context. It's Christianity, it's the Philippines, it's Asia, blah, blah, blah. You were talking about widening the net,
That's
right?
right.
And the question was about it. You know where I'm from, right?
Of course, I know.
So I was seeing all of this playing out in a Jewish context, right? In which the same argument are made for the purpose of all kinds of things, and also a lot of violence that is happening right now, or in creating an exclusive by definition society. And even though Judaism is not a messianic religion that aims at converting anybody, they are using religion for the purpose of justifying loss of life, right? But I wanted to then jump to the main comment and the question that was asked in terms of these networks of connection.
Yeah, that's right.
That sometimes transcend religious leanings, right? So you will see the Israeli government basically creating or fostering those connections with the same illegal religious theocracies all over the world, regardless of whether they are Catholic or Christian. It's not because of the religion per se, although there's seed there that is very similar in terms of religious ethno-nationalism, right? So
No, I'm just taking note of that now. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's actually kind of interesting because I was thinking about like that insulation section, because I know in the United States, like evangelicals especially, I'm not Catholic, I haven't been Catholic, so can't speak to this, but I know like evangelicals and Protestants in the United States tend to be very insulated from anything outside, because anything outside could be corrupting, could be cause us issues. That's also like really useful for the United States as a colonizing history. So let's not talk about all these other countries that we colonized, because maybe we'll see some kind of imprints that we don't like. When you have these mega churches and these religious institutions in the Philippines, do they do that same kind of insulation of don't look at these other countries?
Interesting. Yes and no. I have some privy information about how certain evangelicals, for example, it's a network of the smartest Filipinos who are really afraid that there's a bill right now. Well, there's always been this bill that would protect the LGBTQ plus from anti-discrimination, from all sorts of discrimination, but it hasn't been passed. And what they're really afraid of is that this is a slippery slope to same-sex marriage, because the moment you make discrimination front and center of the law, then it opens up the floodgates, if you will, for same-sex marriage. The discourse that they're getting, because I have written about religious freedom more than 10 years ago, I readily recognized the language that they're using. Religious freedom, religious freedom. This is US religious freedom. Religious freedom was heavily weaponized by the evangelicals here. So in that sense, they're actually not insulated. They are drawing, from discourse about, okay, how did the Americans do it? How did So that's one way of looking at it. But the other way, and again, the more ethnographic way of challenging way of doing it is through the ambient theology or the God talk. What do people talk about on the ground? What sort of books are they reading? What sort of materials? What sort of radio programs are they listening to? Which pastors are doing and there are Christian stations in the Philippines that broadcast American preachings and preachers. And that is another conduit. It takes a lot of good ethnography to do that. Yeah, thank you, Chris. It's brilliant. So it's not, in that sense, it's not as insulated as it might be, from the outside.
I just have a quick question. I'm curious about the book. I mean, one of the kind of things that is circulating in this conversation and through your material, but which you don't mention, is sort of media theory. And obviously, what you're talking about here, you talk about Habermas, but you don't talk about publicity and your theory of sort of mass publicity. And this is actually a story about the production of mass publics. And they're obviously the global publics, and they're and you just mentioned radio and these things. And I know we don't have time to get into it, but I keep thinking of William Mazzarella's The Man of Mass Society. And it gets back to this question of belief, and what he talks about is, the kind of recursive relationship between that, like what happens in a resonant encounter, as he calls it, when sort of publics are conjured into being. So there's a kind of the sort of archive of sort of the affective archive, which is then sort of hailed or sort of made manifest or conjured into being by the kind of moment of enunciation, but through media technology.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, do you deal with like publics and media? And
I would love to in the next book.
book.
Right, because initially I thought that this book is going to cover all bases. I thought that was the plan until I started, and then I arrived here, and then I said, "Oh my God, I don't have the energy to be looking at Facebook posts, and I'll die, because it's so traumatic. Also, I need to have my own PTSD, session with our counselor here. When you think about it, confront this. The 30 was already traumatic,
I thought you meant the trauma of finishing a book and realizing you have another book. Like
that. We have something to write about in the other group.
Trauma and promising career.
Right.
You got it. Something has to give.
Well, I think we're supposed to wrap
Super.
up.
Yeah,
Wait, Data said something. Oh no, it's just my question in the chat, so don't worry about it. If there are others in the
I see.
we already asked.
That was it. That was really smart. That was it. That was really. Thank you so much. This has been truly wonderful. Really, thank you. I really appreciate it.
I appreciated the final